Close your eyes and picture an alien abduction. You almost certainly see the exact same things everyone else does: hairless gray beings, blinding white clinical rooms, and an eerie beam of light descending into the dark woods. Skeptics have a very straightforward explanation for why these details are so incredibly consistent across thousands of reports. They point to Hollywood blockbusters, cheap sci-fi paperbacks, and late-night television hardwiring these exact images into our collective subconscious. But tucked away in the obscure files of regional investigators is a case from northern Minnesota that complicates that theory. Two young adults, completely disconnected from paranormal culture, reported an experience in 1974, years before the modern UFO craze saturated the media. Because they had almost zero exposure to pop culture aliens, their encounter acts as a rare control group. It allows us to examine the mechanics of an abduction story stripped of outside influence. In mid-July 1974, the setting provided its own kind of isolation. The location was a family-owned retreat in heavily wooded northern Minnesota, accessible only by a long dirt road with zero neighbors. The couple staying there, identified only as Steve and Dawn, were ordinary college students with a love for the outdoors. They spent their days off the grid, relying on oil lanterns and a generator, far removed from televisions or newsstands. That extreme physical disconnection creates a psychological vacuum. When you remove the noise of modern life, the human mind is left entirely alone with whatever anomalies it might encounter in the dark. Late one evening, after their campfire had burned down to embers, the absolute blackness of the lake was broken. A brilliant, silent orb of light appeared low over the water, shifting colors from white to pale yellow as it moved erratically towards the shore. As a smaller beam detached, Steve felt an intense compulsion to walk directly toward the water's edge. Dawn panicked, physically grabbing him and struggling to pull him back toward the safety of the trees. This diagram illustrates sensory deprivation. When a person is cut off from external stimuli, like in a pitch-black forest, the brain hyper-focuses processing power onto any sudden visual anomaly, temporarily overriding logic and spatial awareness. In a state like that, even a conventional trigger, a passing satellite, a meteor, or a sudden burst of sleep paralysis, can cause a profound psychological shock. The sighting reached its climax when a sudden blinding flash engulfed Steve and Dawn, abruptly severing their conscious experience. Their next memory was jarring. They were suddenly standing near the cabin steps. It was near dawn. The recently fed campfire was completely dead, and they both suffered from extreme exhaustion, headaches, and a harsh metallic taste in their mouths. 3 to 4 hours of the night were entirely unaccounted for. We can see the mechanics of missing time, a timeline representing continuous memory snaps under intense trauma, leaving a black box gap. But the brain abhors a vacuum. The fractured edges reach across the gap with blurred lines, desperately trying to weave a continuous narrative. That 3-hour void becomes a massive blank canvas. It sits waiting for the mind to construct a reality to make sense of the missing time. For years, Steve and Dawn largely suppressed the event, but in the early 1980s, both began suffering from recurring, matching nightmares of bright rooms and shadowy figures, eventually pushing them to contact a local researcher. The researcher arranged for a licensed psychologist to conduct regressive hypnosis sessions. Regressive hypnosis is a controversial technique intended to retrieve buried memories by guiding patients into deeply relaxed states. Steve and Dawn were interviewed separately, with strict protocols to prevent crosstalk. Despite the isolation of the interviews, their recovered memories aligned perfectly. Both described being lifted by a beam into a circular craft where small, large-headed, grayish beings performed a calm but invasive clinical examination, communicating telepathically. This alignment brings us to confabulation, where the brain creates false memories to fill gaps. By the 1980s, pop culture images of gray aliens had saturated society. Watch as ambient UFO icons filter down, filling the 1974 timeline and solidifying into a rigid, definitive memory. The memories recovered in that office serve as a flawless map. They show exactly how 1980s cultural osmosis can seep backward to to fill a deeply unsettling 1974 memory vacuum. When investigators looked for hard proof at the Minnesota cabin, they found an absolute void. There were no landing traces near the shoreline, no elevated radiation levels, and no physical marks or implants recovered from the witnesses. Yet the lack of physical evidence hasn't changed the minds of the people who lived it. Today, now in their 70s, Steve and Dawn reportedly still stand by the absolute reality of their recovered memories. Without tangible proof, their story cannot be verified by science. It remains permanently locked as a subjective, unprovable experience. This obscure, barely documented case in the deep woods maps flawlessly onto the most famous UFO incidents in history. It checks every single box of the classic abduction blueprint. But the presence of those identical details doesn't inherently prove extraterrestrial visitation. Instead, it proves how remarkably consistent the human brain is when forced to structure profound, unexplained trauma. The bright lights, the missing time, the cold clinical examinations, these elements might not be evidence of advanced technology. They appear to be embedded deep within the architecture of human psychology itself. Whether these memories were deliberately placed by visitors from another world or unconsciously constructed by isolated human minds trying to survive the dark, cases like Steve and Dawn's remind us of a recurring truth. The most extraordinary mysteries we face often originate exactly where no one else is looking.